This book is a love story, and I thought that it would be prudent to just introduce you to the two people who fall in love in the book. And so they each have a voice in the book, and I'll read you a little part from each of their chapters. And this first part is from Ben, and all you need to know about Ben is that at this point in the book, you have learned that he's rich. He's been away to the West Coast. He's blown a lot of money and opportunities, and he's sort of retreated back to Wisconsin after screwing up all of his chances, and he's trying to get his life back together in his early 30s. And the excuse for him to come back is that his uncle died and has a nice house in Wisconsin, and there's no one there to take care of the house. And they can't sell it, the real estate market is all screwed up, and so he's going to watch the house. A bunch of teenagers partied in it a couple of months ago, and so he's there to kind of watch over it and take care of it. My sinecure was to guard the house. It was my job to clean it up, fix it up, and do whatever needed to be done in order to usher it onto the market and get it sold. For my services as flipper and resident, per insane agreement with my father, I was to receive 25% on the sale, which was a stupid percentage for the work I would be doing. But my father was aware that my whole trust was shot, and he had to have his suspicions about the extent of my debt, too. He knew for sure that I had nothing, is what I'm saying, and he had found a way to give me, at the very least, ground upon which I might potentially stand again. They had inherited Denny's house, but my parents wanted nothing to do with the place. My dad thought it was haunted by his brother's ghost. I think the whole thing just made my mother sad beyond words, and that she couldn't bear to think of Denny dying alone in the basement sanding a table like he had. She never wanted to see the house again, she said. That was all well and good and would have been no trouble in 2002, but now, because the real estate market had tanked, especially for old, unusual homes in little Wisconsin towns and ones that needed work to boot, there was no telling how long it would take to sell. After the Independence Day fiesta, the pressure had gone up. Now my parents thought of the house as more of a liability than an asset. What if those kids had burned it down and fried themselves during the party? What if snakes took over the basement? You know all the nightmares. What if hobos began to squat? The risks were intolerable. My dad called Portland in July. I have an alternative to your reprehensible plan to travel around the world, Ben. You might call it a favor. I had happened upon a copy of Eat, Pray, Love at the bookstore and had sent my parents a postcard telling them that I was going to do it too. I'm not traveling around the world, I said. That was a joke. We have an alternative. He explained his fears about Denny's house. Why don't you just sell it for half of what it's worth, I said, and just be done with it. It's not like you need the money, and there's no mortgage anymore, right? He laughed. This was a nice July day out west. I was sitting on my front porch in Portland with a cup of coffee resting on my stomach, my feet up, crossed over the white paint chips of my railing, book, Vonnegut, Galapagos, hugging the arm of the chair, glad we had the sun. It was July 13th, I think, a Sunday, and I hadn't seen my mother or father since May, when they'd come to visit after my release, and we'd spent 3 uncomfortable days going out to meal after meal in the nicest Portland restaurants, only to sit in an awkward triangle around the different tables as I said nothing about my time in Chested. He was in white-collar prison for a little while. And my mother attempted to keep things lively by flirting with the sommeliers. We talked when Denny died too, but I hadn't come home for the funeral, nor had I wanted to. Not because I didn't think that what had happened to him was sad, but because I guessed it would have been impossible for me to stay sober at the wake, and I had been doing well. Word to the wise, to those who will one day follow in my footsteps, it's a hell of a lot easier to reinvent yourself when your family is not there. I explained my non-appearance away. They seemed to accept it. I'd gotten a new copywriting job in June, even after checking the I am a felon box on the application. Hilarious. And I told my parents that my employer, a pharmaceutical company called Krieg Industries, wouldn't give me the days off. In truth, I didn't even ask. The day after Denny had his heart attack and died, I got laid off anyway, right along with every other employee at Krieg. They had tanked. The FDA had pulled the plug during the phase 2 trials of what the company had hoped would be its flagship drug. It was called Hezonica, and it was supposed to help men stop snoring, which it did. but it also decreased the circumferences of their testicles. That sort of solution, said my father, responding to my idea of selling Denny's house cheap, is how you started with money and now have nothing. And why your sister started with the same amount of money and now has quite a lot, Ben. But isn't it all profit anyway, I said? And besides, I added, isn't there a value to having the inconvenience gone? There is, yes, he said. But just because that's the case, it doesn't mean you have to immediately make a rash decision. I have a different idea. Let me run it by you. Okay. What exactly is your current employment situation? Are they still wearing you out at that drug shop, Creed? No. No? The snore pills shrunk everyone's balls. What? He said. It turned out that the drug, along with being the cure for snoring, shrunk everyone's testicles. By how much? The company is dead, Dad. I got laid off last week. That's the whole story. Entirely dead? Dead. Gone. It's an amazing time in the American economy, he mused. And I imagined him grin-squinting like Theodore Roosevelt, shaking his head because of course he was insulated from it all. As an executive at Headley, he would continue to get richer as the realities of our failing economy became more and more apparent in the coming years. As payback for moments of smugness such as this one, for a long time, it had given me great satisfaction to imply to members of my family, by way of well-placed hints here and there, that I believed in Soviet-style communism. The simple truth, though, was that I didn't understand money. I just didn't. I didn't want to. I still don't want to. And while I was aware then that this was a paradoxical privilege of the wealthy, to be able to choose to not understand it, I hadn't yet come close to realizing how cowardly it was to detach oneself completely from the past. Have you heard about the current state of laymen? My father continued. I suppose you don't follow that kind of thing. But more important, and this means you're currently unemployed? Yes. And that was what my father needed. I unpacked in Denny's room. I hesitated in the hallway, wondering if it might be better to sleep in the living room, on the couch, or in Wayne's room, but Denny's bed was the best, and I didn't want to start my exile on a superstitious note. For all my father's and sister's real politicking about money and life and their cynicism about people and the way things were, for all their realism, their belief in ghosts and spirits was part of their shared ethos, another way in which they were the same. How does that happen? It's as though all worldviews need escape valves of insanity. My mother, who was the principal of an elementary school and who spent a large part of her days talking to people who could barely count or tie their shoes, let alone tell the difference between fantasy and reality, found anything supernatural, whether it was God, pixies, vampires, zombies, werewolves, ghosts, or kraken, to be silly. So did I. I went out to the garage and got Denny's empty blue recycling bin and started cleaning the kitchen, which stank of alcohol. The linoleum underfoot was sticky with spilled beer, but I discovered a half bottle of Mr. Clean under the sink and mopped the floor. Then I gathered up the bottles and the cans. I found Denny's liquor cabinet and poured everything he had down the sink. After 4 or 5 bottles, the smell was strong enough to push me into the other room. I took a break and put on side 2 of the CSNY, and then went and looked at the photos on the mantle. There were some pictures of Denny and my father as boys, a few of the whole family, and single shots of me, Haley, and Wayne, all from our high school years. We were the 3 of this generation. My picture was one I had seen 1,000 times in my parents' house. My hair was longer than my face skinnier, but I had the same raised eyebrow dipshit smirk I always wore when someone told me to smile. I looked at Wayne. He was smiling a big toothed smile as though the person taking the picture had caught him in the act of laughing, a genuine laugh, the opposite of mine. The guy had probably only said, "Say cheese," in a lifeless monotone. I remembered that about my cousin. As long as he detected a try at humor, he would give up a good yelp. His hair was bushy and curly, and in the picture he wore a white button-down and a tie, even though he'd gone to St. Helens High just like me, and we had no uniforms. There was something about Wayne, though, in that era of his life, informal, but I could see him dressing up on picture day on principle, when most of his peers would have been wearing the same t-shirts they always wore. He cared about stuff like that, and he always had. He looked neither dark nor depressed. He looked happy. This was taken before college. It was past 8 o'clock, deep into dusk, when I finally hauled the full recycling bin to the end of the driveway. There were too many bottles for the one bin, so I ended up using Denny's wheelbarrow for the second load. I had worked up a sweat cleaning, and my white t-shirt was wet at the chest and under my arms. Out at the end of the driveway, I saw some headlights. Unlike the county highways that crisscrossed Wisconsin and made the state into a grid of boxes, Bow Point Road, Denny's Road, wound up through the woods and the hills like a deer path, connected maybe 20 homes to Highway 121, which led to St. Helens downtown, and eventually became Main Street. Denny's house wasn't really in a neighborhood, and there wasn't all that much traffic on the road. I stood and watched, one hand on the wheelbarrow and one hand on my hip. I watched as a pickup truck towing a horse trailer wound up the hill. The truck eased around the bend. I don't think the driver looked at me, and the light was not good at all. But as it passed, I was surprised to realize that the woman driving looked familiar. This is the other part of the love story. She doesn't make an appearance until a little later in the book. And Ben doesn't see her until even after this part. But she sort of announces herself here in the next chapter. So I'll read a bit from her. This chapter is called Space Station. In 1987, my mother, Miriam Sheehan, finally got up the courage to run away from my father, David Ryan Sheehan, who had moved the family to Montreal the year before and who would sometimes punch my mother in the face at the dinner table. My brother Bobby says he remembers this happening every night. Remembers the crack of the impact and the blood, the Kleenex, the cut short cries, the sound of the silverware on the floor, the drag of the wooden chair leg, and the scramble afterward. The earnest explanations once the emergencies were through. Long talks from our father sitting on our beds telling us in a patient voice that it had been an accident, unintentional, that he was sorry, that he was only glad that our mother was okay and had not been hurt. All of the things. But I think Bobby has embellished what was real in order to fill the gaps of what he doesn't know and what he can't remember, as we are all wont to do. This is Lauren. What I mean is that I don't think it happened every night, just some nights. Back then, my mother's only skills were gardening and child rearing, and it's best to think of that second skill in the loosest way possible if you don't like to imagine her with any accuracy. I don't say that because I want to ignore everything she did for my brother and me, or to be dismissive about how courageous she was to run away with us, or to minimize how hard it must have been for her, those first years especially. I say it to emphasize how vulnerable she was economically once we were on our own, and how much that matters when you're in a bad situation, even more when you're a woman. The same thing happened to me. I had not seen it coming. I hadn't learned anything, and it is disturbing to me that I could have been so blind even after I had learned the lesson once. And also, finally, I say it to acknowledge that hard truth about people, how you can be a brave person in the world, and make sacrifices and do a number of good things but still not be exactly good. I'm sorry. She was born in Atlanta, but had lost her accent by the time I met her, which was when I began to exist, which was technically in October of 1977, although my consciousness didn't perceive her as a person to meet until somewhere around 1978 or 1979, when I knew that she was not myself. She was third generation Hungarian American. She liked beets. Until a few years ago, her hair was brown and had a curl to it, and she kept it shoulder length, but when it started to go gray, she switched colors to something I would call almost black. She wasn't pretty, my mother, but I realized now that she had sex appeal, maybe a lot of sex appeal. She had a way about her that fascinated men, verve. I feel stiff when I think of myself in relation to her, and I think I even did when I was small. The way she walked, the way she spoke, the way she laughed, the color of her lips, or perhaps the way she bent them around certain words. I couldn't do any of that. And I was jealous of all the things she knew how to do, and even though she also used to tell me how I was prettier than she'd ever been, and even though she used to brush my hair for hours at a time and tell me that it would always be something special that I had, and that most women would kill for the hair that I had, which was probably from my father's side. My mother made me angry, just generally, and was bound up in not being able to be what she was. I think it took her as long as it did to pack us up and leave Montreal because she was practical. She imagined herself alone with 2 young children, with nothing whatsoever, and realized it would be only a matter of time before social services, either Canadian or American, wherever she took us, would find her unfit and incapable because of the money, and either send us back to Montreal and our father, who had money then, or put us under government care. And from that point, who knew what could happen? That's a mother's worst nightmare, and she could see a simple chain of events that would get us there. She was very, very careful. Neither of her parents were alive by the time we made our big escape, but she did have a half-sister who lived in Santa Fe, and through some long-developed system of codes built right into the letters that they sent to each other. And yes, our father really was the kind of man, at that time at least, who would get jealous if he saw his wife had received a letter from somebody, man or woman, and he would read whatever he found. The two women organized my mother's departure from hell, and from Canada, and from him, which happened under the guise of a vacation to Niagara Falls. The three of us were U.S. citizens already, and it was our father who was Canadian. It wasn't hard for us to get across the border, and it's not as though we had to request asylum or do anything dramatic. They don't do that for domestic abuse. We were just running. Thanks.